Everyone, welcome to the Property Journey Podcast. Beginner to expert, Mr. Duggan. How are we? Back again.
Good. The weeks disappear, don't they?
The weeks disappear and we're always busy. I always find. It's been an interesting week in the property market. There's been a few things that I've picked up on my research, as I say. Obviously wanting to become the expert, but we're a long way off yet. I had noted down that obviously in the news, we touched on it actually, the last episode was the renter reform bill. So again, England only at the minute, but there was different things in the news about it, about certain things to help renters as well as the landlords, for stuff to do with eviction notices and stuff as well in there. So it'll be interesting to see how that pans out in the mainland as such first. And obviously then I was reading as well that a couple of mortgage companies have dropped their the mortgage rates based on the good news of inflation starting to come down. So,
well, as we've always said, interest rates have been going up and up and up, and that's the Bank of England's way of trying to control the economy. And we have seen every time the Bank of England has put up an interest rate, it has had an impact on mortgage rates, because banks are just, high street banks just don't know what's going to happen for the next week or two, so they can be a bit hesitant and they maybe pause applications, or they maybe pause their rates and things like that. So it's certainly sounding positive that the high street banks are getting back on board. Inflation's coming down. We've still a fair bit to go now to reach the target, but it's definitely, at least it's heading in the right direction.
I think whenever I was doing my reading, it was more it had come down, inflation rates had come down more, it had come down more than what they were expecting. Therefore, the banks or the mortgage providers have
sent out a positive feedback or vibe to the high street market,
and to that news. So I was following a wee bit and kind of keeping my eye on what was going on, and there were a few things that I picked up on. But today's episode, I want to focus on specifically house prices and how.
In general,
how you do you maybe decide your house price, what maybe implications on your house price, say for example if you have an older property, a newer property, where your property is located, or the areas that you're maybe looking to buy in, how is that kind of house, because we all know that in different areas house prices and different types of house, you have different house prices. So I kind of wanted to discuss just in a general form how that's decided, maybe certain things that you need to consider as well. So that's kind of where I see this episode going. To make it quite clear, this is going to be specifically house prices and not mortgage rates. Because obviously some people do tie in house prices and then the price of a mortgage, and they might think that that's what we're talking about, but it's specifically what you're going to pay for the house in terms of the grand figure, as we like to say. So what, in an overview, and I suppose in a nutshell, what would be the primary factors that would influence a house price as such?
Generally you see the likes of the style or the type of the property. So you normally find maybe apartments, would be at the entry level of prices. Then you move up to maybe a 2-bedroom house, a 3-bedroom house, whether it's a semi-detached, whether it's even a townhouse, terraced house, up to a detached house. So they're the different factors, and then you start to add in maybe the age of it, the condition, as in, is it structurally in good order, then internally is it modern, and then you move on to location. Whereabouts in the country is it? Is it urban? Is it rural? Is it more in an upmarket area? So it's a mixture of all those things put together, then has basically initially determines the price, and then ultimately the market demand, as in how much is somebody willing to pay for a property in that area, is what sets the price.
And even just from hearing that, there's no easy kind of calculation that you can kind of make that is going to decide your house price then.
Without the likes of an estate agent or a valuer or a surveyor would be able to really home in on that, but generally just there's no exact from my point of view, there's no exact science to it, but certainly maybe in a few weeks' time we'll get somebody in and we'll put that exact question to them.
Well, 100% actually, that'll be a good idea. I'm not sure if they'll be happy enough because God knows what I might hit them with. But we'll definitely try and get that in if they maybe do have an exact science. So like obviously then there's different things as well. And we've already talked about some of those. In terms of you touched on it, the sort of the market side of things, which again is going to bring in your inflation and your interest rates. It's also going to decide on the value of your house because it's impacting the market.
It would have an impact. It would have a factor on it. So ultimately, initially people are going to want a product, and the product is the house that they want to buy in the area that they buy. And then if they haven't done their homework, then they'll start to look at the finances side of things. And at that point, that's when people start to figure out, have they got enough deposit? How much do they have to borrow, and how much is it going to cost them?
And I suppose in today's market as well, obviously, as we've discussed, interest rates have risen. Therefore, some people are quite hesitant with their money and their finances. Therefore, if there's a lack of demand in the market, the prices can fall. Would that be a fair assumption? Obviously, you still have to consider the supply.
Yeah.
And at the minute we've well documented that rental properties and also people trying to buy houses, the supply is still relatively low anyway. So
at the minute, prices are always determined by supply and demand. And I know locally in the area that I operate from, there is still a big shortage of good quality properties. And generally, if there's a good property on the market, there does be good interest in it, and there can be a rally in the price.
And that was actually, again, flip back to my news reading this week. There was actually saying, and again, they didn't actually give Northern Ireland specifics, but they were giving specifics in the mainland, that for some properties, there's a list of up to 30 people trying to essentially get that one property. And that's a clear sign of the demand for housing and for properties in, well, I suppose you could say the UK, but you've already seen that resonating here as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
And in terms of then, and that's the supply and demand, and again, supply demand, that kind of market side of things with inflation and interest rates is all a major part of it as well. But what about the regional or like geographical location of your house? Because it's quite interesting sometimes, because if you flick on to an estate agent or a website that's listing properties, you can see sometimes that there's houses in the city centre that are quite cheap, but in return you can see houses in the countryside that are quite cheap, and vice versa. Some in the city centre are quite dear, some in the countryside are quite dear. Would it be more affected by location, where it's close to a certain area, or
it's a number of things? It's the area, access, roads, transport, things like that. But generally, some areas you just become, they're affluent or they're a wee bit more upmarket, and nearly every town is like that as well. Some developments, for instance, would maybe get a reputation whereby it's a particular class of person or profession that maybe buys in an area, and that can have an impact on the price as well.
And I suppose that's I never actually thought about it, but if in a certain area there's a lot of new housing developments and there's a lot more positivity, say, in and around that local area, that can also have an impact because it becomes this highly sought after.
I can think of 2-3 developments, for instance, maybe in and around Portadown, that literally the builders nearly don't even have to advertise. They've got such a fantastic reputation that they build a different type of a house. It's the finish, the quality is unbelievable, that people are completely queuing up. They can't wait to get those houses. And even in a resale market, we see that if a house goes up for sale in any of those developments, they're snapped up so quickly.
And that can have a positive impact on the the local area as well, because if more people are moving into, for example, you use the example of Portadown, if more people are there and there's maybe more jobs being created in that area, then Portadown becomes a highly sought after area.
Yeah.
Therefore, houses outside of even those developments, I would assume the prices may start to rise then, because there's more of a demand in that one local area.
Yeah. Well, to give you a good example, what I've seen over the years is generally Belfast is quite an expensive area to purchase in. And over my almost 2 decades of this, I've seen then a lot of people who Belfast is outside their budget. So what they do is they buy in and around Lisburn, for instance, because it's, there's the motorway, it's so close to it. So we saw a big demand in Lisburn. Then we're now seeing that there's a demand for the likes of the Dromore area and the Banbridge area. So it's coming out and out and out. So they're still like on the motorway, dual carriage way, within maybe 20-40 minutes you're straight into Belfast. So that's a good example of how an area can rise in price and then have a knock-on impact.
And nearly what you would describe as the ripple effect.
It's like a pebble in the pond. Yeah.
And you could go round in circles in some of these things as well. And I'd previously mentioned there about the job market, and it can have an impact on house prices as well. If there's, say for example, high unemployment, which we would have got probably 15 years ago when, obviously the housing crash and stuff like that, and high unemployment would then lead to, obviously, essentially people not being able to afford to buy a home. Therefore prices would come down. It's back to the supply and demand. But if there's strong employment, which we have seen over the course of the last 15 years, where we've been building. And
there's a shortage of workers as well, so that there's plenty of work and there's not enough people to actually do the work. So affordability generally shouldn't be an issue for a lot of people, because there's plenty of jobs out there.
And I suppose again that reflects on a certain area. If there's strong employment in a certain area, people tend to want to obviously live close to the place of work. And if you've got a strong employment base in and around a certain area, you're going to find there's more demand for houses in that area. Because I myself is from the Causeway Coast area, and I have noticed that there's been a real demand in that area for housing, and that's even outside of the towns. Sometimes it's around the coastal areas. Again, is the flip side of that mainly due to some people like the location because it's on the north coast?
The north coast, it's a slightly different topic, but I suppose the principles are the same. The north coast there's been a lot of demand for the north coast, and there's a big shortage of properties, and the demand is probably driven by a number of people who want to buy a second home. Maybe people we've seen quite a few people maybe who are English or from somewhere else, and they want to buy. They can sell up in England and buy a beautiful, maybe even a bigger house on the north coast, and end up being mortgage free or cash free, and a lot of people working from home.
That's actually quite interesting. That so that's even bringing in people from the mainland essentially that are moving across, because property prices, would you say, are generally cheaper?
In the mainland, prices have always been much higher. Likewise, prices are a lot higher in the south. But what we have seen is a good rise in the last maybe 2 to 5 years in Northern Ireland. So we are catching up. But the north coast, to go back to it, is a highly sought after area, and that's what's drawn people from all over.
And I suppose actually, even to think about that point, it's nearly more common sense, because the cost of living in Northern Ireland, generally speaking, would have been cheaper than
lower than the mainland.
Hence the knock-on effect of that. Sometimes you spring these things in my head, so you do.
Talking out loud, you always think these things.
And again, it's back to that aspect as well of the consumer confidence in house prices, and it's more, sometimes you decide whether or not you want to purchase, for example, a new water bottle. If I have my consumer confidence is kind of going, I can afford it or I can't afford it, that can obviously have a knock-on effect then on terms of the supply and demand again.
It comes back to, you buy and you commit yourself to what to what you need.
Yeah.
So for instance, if it's something where you want to buy a holiday home and you've got affordability and you've got the money there and it's something that you're going to use, well, certainly buy it. Likewise, if you're buying a house to live in, buy a house that suits your needs. The big issues normally arise whenever people maybe they stretch themselves too far, where they're just living well beyond their means. They maybe want the bigger house that they shouldn't have or that they don't need. It's in an area where they probably could do without, but simply this is a matter of maybe they're drawn to the fact of being able to tell people where they live, as opposed to, does that property actually suit their needs? And generally, if you buy a property that suits your needs, it's regardless of whether prices go up or go down, because it suits you.
Yeah, and I suppose that's an interesting point, because we've discussed previously about your house shouldn't essentially be what it looks like. It should be, does it suit your needs? Does it carry out everything that you need it to do? Is it going to be livable? Are you going to be happy in it? Those styles of things. So I suppose, as you say, price maybe shouldn't matter in those aspects, but it's obviously going to matter because it needs to still be within your budget. And do you, obviously then the condition and age is something that you brought up as well, so, and you never know what way that's going to work either, because and I'm not saying that all new builds or anything like that there, but a new build, you would assume the condition of it is going to be up to a higher standard than an older.
Well, the big benefit is with a brand new house, you get a 10-year warranty. So at least you've the comfort of knowing that for the first 10 years of ownership, that if there's structural issues, there you're covered. But then likewise, with a pre-owned house, it might be something where you want to actually come in and put your own stamp on the house. So it comes back to, again, your needs and your wants.
And I like that the condition age side of things as well, is like a lot of people sometimes think to themselves, I need a new build house because it's not it's not that old, it's maybe only 2 or 3 years old. I should be able to get 20, 30, 40 years out of this. The flip side of it is an older house as well has been built and still standing after 20 years, so like the age sometimes I think people maybe focus on and kind of go, oh, it's an older house, I'm not too sure about that. Whereas if you think on it, it's a house and it's meant to stand, and the chances of having real issues with it is probably quite slim. Yeah. Especially if you obviously get a survey done and make sure that everything's in order. So like, would you say age from a personal opinion is important, or
it's not particularly? No. I suppose one comment that would quite often come up is some people maybe think with an older house it's harder to heat. That could be arguable, but I think if the house is run properly, it generally shouldn't be an issue. So a surveyor informed me one time, is just to explain, an old house, it's not built like today. New houses today generally have 2 rows of block or bricks, and you have your cavity inside, whereas traditionally years ago, hundreds of years ago, it's simply a solid wall built with stones. So what a lot of people do is they maybe come in the winter, they turn the heat on for an hour. Yes, the heat will throw out of the radiators and the rooms will heat up, but as soon as you turn the heat off, then the temperature will drop down again. But if heated properly, so if the heat's on regularly for longer periods, those stones over a period of weeks and months will just gradually heat up and will hold the heat, so that then you don't need as much heat on. So for instance, in my house at home, whether I'm during the winter months, if I'm home at night or in the evenings or not, the heat is still on for a set number of hours in the morning, in the evening, to keep a constant heat. Now, I'm not saying you keep the heat on all the time, because there's different theories about that as well, but what I'm saying is you don't let the temperature of the house drop dramatically, because you're losing the efficiency in getting the house heated up again. So if run properly, an older house shouldn't you shouldn't be put off by an older house.
And I suppose as well, it's like I've obviously previously lived in a terraced house as well, and the heat in even those houses, because of they're stuck in a row. You know, you've only got your front and your back essentially that's exposed.
Yeah.
The heat in the upstairs of them sometimes would nearly put you out.
Yeah.
You know, but if you had a bungalow, you've maybe got 4 walls that are, you know, out facing, and essentially could end up losing more heat with that. So there's probably different things that you could really, you know, we could probably get bogged down into really discussing this and having a real debate about it.
It's a complete different topic. You know, a house on that note actually comes with an energy performance certificate, and it gives you a rating of how efficient the house is. So that can give you an indication before you buy the house. And it could be something that, yes, the rating might be a wee bit lower than what you want, but it does give you suggestions as to what changes need to be implemented to increase it. So it might be just the case of buying a new boiler, replacing the boiler, and those sorts of things.
Would the likes of like insulation and stuff fall in under that as well? You know,
So an EPC will give you all that. It'll tell you if there's insulation in, or it'll maybe give you an assumption if there's insulation and what the rating is, and perhaps if you did increase or install insulation, then that'll improve it. But on a separate note, or a bit similar to it, is all brand new houses have to have a minimum rating, and then there's new requirements as well of the type of heating systems and things like that, and that's more of a drive by the overall government to try and keep it's probably not so much to do with living costs or efficiency. It's really more so about the environment, as to reduce the that impact.
Does that sort of filter into if your house, for example, is well insulated and it holds the heat, for example, then you shouldn't need to burn as much?
In theory, yes, you're burning less fuels and spending less money. Yeah.
And would you say, Roy, every market you hear of has a cycle? And I might be completely off topic here, but would you say that the property market itself has a cycle where, you know, there's obviously peaks and troughs? You know, is that kind of common?
It can be. So in theory and over a long period of time, property will rise, and you will come up and down peaks and troughs. As to how much a price drops and how much a price rises, it completely depends on the factors at that time,
which we're essentially talking about at the start of the podcast here.
I can remember 20 years ago, house prices, the houses being built, you know, at that time people thought the prices were absolutely crazy. There's a local development I can remember, a builder built them, I think, where they were being sold for maybe 50,000, 60,000, and at that time people thought that was completely crazy, and they were maybe a wee bit slow to sell. And that house today at 50,000 is probably worth not far off 150,000.
I know, and that's actually quite interesting as well, because I remember, now we're probably chatting well over 10 years now, but Ballykelly, the army camps, the housing within them was being sold off.
Right.
And at that stage, some of the houses were being sold off for, I think it was between 30 and 40,000. You know, and we're chatting potentially, it was about 10, 15 years ago. You know, and to pick up a house for 30 or 40,000 10 or 15 years ago is even quite scary to think about, you know, considering today's house prices.
But generally people at that time probably thought that was a wee bit more, that was a bit costly.
A lot of work to be done to them, you know, there's no denying that either. Obviously they were probably sitting quite derelict for a few years or whatever, so there was a lot of probably cleaning and updating and stuff needed to be done to them. But, you know, for that stage, as you say, they would have been considered quite, you know, costly. And, you know, I wouldn't be too sure what the price would be now for them, but you know, I would say it's a considerable bit more. So, and I suppose it's like everything, as the supply and the demand rises and falls, obviously your prices has to match that. You know, if the demand's not there in the market, you can't simply charge an arm and a leg for a house, because no one's gonna pick it up. And the same that if the supply is quite high, your price has to match how high that is. And like, what would you say are the common like misconceptions around prices? You know, for some people, they might look at a house and, you know, they see a 5 bedroom house somewhere and it's 200,000, for example. Then they look at another one and it's 260,000.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of go, why? You know, like, is there any common kind of misconceptions, or is it kind of most of the reasons that we've talked about?
A big misunderstanding is really, or maybe a misinterpretation, is confidence. You know, in times of uncertainty, you know, people maybe start to think, oh, I'll hold off and I'll hold off, I'm not going to buy. And it comes back to, if you need a house, you know, it's probably best to go on ahead and do it. You know, to give you an example, back in late 2020, coming out of COVID, I was coming across quite a few clients who were saying, you know what, things are going to be bad here, and they actually sold up and got out of the market. And lo and behold, between 2020 and 2023, it's probably been the biggest rise that there's ever been. So likewise, there's a bit of uncertainty that can be filtered incorrectly at the minute, because in England and Scotland, it's a completely different market to us. They have different price rises and price falls. And if you hear that on the media, a lot of people misinterpret that for Northern Ireland. We're completely different. We have our own market. So if it is something that you want to research, make sure you're researching the data for Northern Ireland as opposed to the mainland. But if you really want accurate data, simply phone around local estate agents and just see what the state of play is. And when you start to bid or look at a few houses, you'll soon start to see if that there's demand and people are still bidding on properties.
Well, that's what I was going to suggest, that obviously the estate agents themselves are essentially on the ground dealing with it, you know, day in, day out, you know, and they've got new listings coming in, or they've either sold properties, and they could probably give you a fair guesstimate on what a price is in a certain area for exactly what you want.
Yeah.
And you know, because there's certain things, as I say, and the point that you raised there as well is the news. The news can be quite doom and gloom about everything.
It always is.
And it always is. No matter what, you turn on the news, sometimes I wonder why we all sit and watch it, because most times there's nothing actually, you know, positive about it. And I think I've touched on this before, where the news can sort of be quite doom and gloom, and it's worst outcome, and it's this big headline that, you know, things are going to go bad. And, you know, I suppose if you have a better understanding on it, and as you say, do your own research, and as well, if it's still within your means, you know, there should be no real reason why not to go and purchase a property if you know that it's still within your means, and you know that it suits your needs, and essentially you maybe need a house, and it's within your timeline as such. Then go ahead. Because as we've said before, if you look at the overall graph, you know, property prices were, you know, like if I remember when my parents bought their house, it was probably in around £25,000. You know, for me, I'm kind of going 25 grand to buy a house.
Buy 10 of them.
You know, I bought 10 of them a few years ago if I'd had a chance, you know. And, you know, for that to then increase over the years, and you understand that, you know, inflation and stuff, that house is maybe currently worth what it is now, and a fair, you know, a fair guide essentially. But prices are always going to go up. Yeah. And we've seen that with everything, food and fuel, and, you know, like as I said, during lockdown, I couldn't believe the fuel was back down at 99p. And look at it where it is now. It went as high as £2. It's come back to 140, but it hasn't dropped back to 99p again. You know, and what's the likelihood of that?
See, for property prices, a safety net is in place there for the borrower or for the buyer, because they're getting a mortgage. So it's not really the buyer who's owning the house, it's the bank who's buying the house. So they're sending somebody out, a valuer, to make sure the house is worth what you're paying for it. Make sure you're not overpaying for a property. So that's a safety net for buyers.
Like, I suppose it boils back down to whether or not it suits you, you know, as you say, and your needs come into it, and also then, you know, certain areas. And you actually made a point, I think, in one of the previous episodes, was to search around. You know, because I could be set on a certain area, and you know I want a 2 or 3 bedroom house in that area. That's me. I want it. If I obviously say to an estate agent or whatever, they could try and go, but you could get a 4 bedroom house 5 miles down the road, in that area for the same price. You know, I suppose if when it boils down to house prices, the best bet would be to speak to an estate agent. Who's going to know more.
It's all about your needs. I've come across different people, as you say, have maybe sold up in the Donaghcloney, Craigavon area, and they were able to actually find a house maybe out in the Tyrone area, and it was a bigger house, suited their needs, and it was maybe for a similar amount of money. And that's simply down to different areas, different locations, different prices.
And again, that can fluctuate, you know, completely. I know obviously the big one at the minute that a lot of people would talk about would be Dublin. You know, and just how crazy they're, you know, Dublin itself, the prices of property. But if you go like essentially the rest of the island, you know, they're saying it doesn't match. You know, Dublin nearly has its own property market essentially because of the huge distortion between that area and you know the rest of the country, which is quite interesting, you know, to kind of see that developing.
There's a lot of international investment things in Dublin too, so that's what has an impact too.
It's back to the job, the strong employment rates, and then obviously the demand for the housing. Well, that's all interesting, so it is, because you know, like house prices is a lot of people do decide mainly on their house based on their house price, you know, and sometimes it maybe is worthwhile kind of looking at it and going, yes, it's within my budget, but does it really suit my needs? You know, and I suppose getting people to sort of think more about that and thinking about their needs rather than maybe the price of the property first, you know, and then deciding that way. We'll leave it there today. I don't want to grill you too much. So as Roy's already suggested, we do hope to actually maybe have an estate agent coming in very shortly. Not in this episode, but certainly in the future, because I want to be able to get a few questions and some of these topics. They may be able to give us maybe another completely different insight. So remember everyone to give us a follow on all our platforms, subscribe to the podcast as well, and remember, if you do have any questions that you would like us to answer, remember to hit us up on social media as well, send us your message and let us know if it's for the podcast or not, and we will answer the questions. So thank you very much all for tuning in again. Thank you, Roy.
Thank you
for providing your knowledgeable insight.
No problem.
And we'll be back soon with the next episode.
Brilliant.